The dust of dusty mesa settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the tongue and clung to the soul. To Celeste Beaumont, it felt less like dirt and more like a final judgment on the land itself. For 3 days, her wagon had creaked through a landscape of scorched grama grass and skeletal junipers until it finally rolled onto the town's single, wide street. The town was a collection of sun-bleached timber buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent expanse of the New Mexico territory. It was the autumn of 1888, and hope, like the water, was running low. Celeste, at 42, had seen enough of the world to know that a place like this could either break you or forge you into something harder than the rock it was built on. She chose forging. With a grunt of effort, she hauled a hand-painted sign from the back of her wagon. The wood was smooth under her calloused fingers, the black letters stark and clear. Seamstress, herbalist, Beaumont. She found a spot near the rickety porch of her new home, a small cabin of weathered gray wood, and began to hammer the signpost into the earth. The ground was like iron. Each strike of the mallet sent a jolt up her arm, a stubborn protest from the parched land. Her property was at the edge of town, a detail for which she was grateful. It afforded her a degree of privacy and, more importantly, it included the Ojo Viejo, the old eye well. It was not a drilled well like the one in the center of town, but a stone-lined spring, ancient and deep, said to have been dug by the Mescalero people generations ago. Its water was cool and sweet, a miracle in this thirsty country. This well was the reason she had spent the last of her savings on the deed. It was life. It was independence. A shadow fell over her as she worked. She did not look up, her focus entirely on driving the post home. "That ground's not in a giving mood, ma'am," a low voice observed. She finished her work with 2 final, solid thuds before straightening up. Wiping a sheen of sweat from her brow at the back of her wrist, she turned to face the speaker. Sheriff Jude Callahan sat atop a sturdy buckskin horse, his hands resting on the saddle horn. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with a face that seemed carved from the same rugged landscape. His eyes, a startling pale blue under the brim of his hat, held a deep-seated weariness that went beyond the day's heat. At 45, he looked like a man who had seen too much and said too little. "The ground rarely is," Celeste replied, her voice smooth with the gentle cadence of her Louisiana upbringing. "One must be persuasive." The corner of Jude's mouth twitched, a faint ghost of a smile. He gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of her grit, and was about to ride on when the sound of boisterous laughter and shuffling feet drew his attention. 3 cowhands, flushed with midday whiskey from the saloon, were making their way toward the cabin. They stopped a few yards away, their eyes fixing on Celeste with a mixture of curiosity and drunken bravado. "Well, look what we have here. The leader," a lanky man with a stained mustache, drawled, "a new bird of paradise flown into our dusty cage." Celeste ignored them, turning her attention to unlatching the cabin door. She had dealt with their kind before. Indifference was the strongest shield. "Don't be rude now," another one chided, stepping closer. "We're the welcoming committee. What's a woman like you doing way out here all alone?" The words "woman like you" were hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Her age, her dark skin, her solitude, all were being weighed and found wanting. Jude's horse shifted, its leather creaking in the silence. The sheriff had not moved, his presence a silent, watchful weight. He believed in letting people handle their own affairs, but he also knew the precise moment when liquor and prejudice were about to curdle into something uglier. He could feel that moment approaching like a change in the weather. Celeste faced them, her posture erect, her gaze steady. "I am here, gentlemen, to make a living, the same as you. Now, if you will excuse me." The lanky one chuckled. "Make a living, honey. You're a little old to be starting fresh, ain't you, especially for a colored woman? A flicker of anger, hot and sharp, pierced Celeste's composure. She fought to keep her voice even. My age and my complexion have no bearing on my ability to thread a needle or mix a poultice. My sign states my business. It does not invite commentary on my person. She's got a tongue on her, the third man said with a smirk. That was enough? Jude cleared his throat. It was not a loud sound, but in the tense quiet, it cracked like a whip. Is there a problem here, boys? The three men turned, their bravado deflating slightly at the sight of the law. No problem. Sheriff, the leader mumbled, shuffling his feet. Just being neighborly. Your neighborliness is starting to look like harassment, Jude said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. This lady is a citizen of Dusty Mesa now. She's entitled to the same peace as anyone else. Find your way back to the saloon. They grumbled under their breaths, but obeyed, casting resentful glances at Celeste as they ambled away. Jude waited until they were a safe distance before turning his pale eyes back to her. My apologies, Mrs. Beaumont. The sun makes some men thirsty, and the whiskey makes them stupid. I have found that to be a universal truth. Sheriff, Celeste said, allowing a small, wry smile to touch her lips. Thank you for your assistance, though I believe I had it in hand. Jude nodded again, a flicker of respect in his gaze. I don't doubt it, but my job is to keep the peace, not watch a fair fight. Welcome to Dusty Mesa. He tipped his hat and nudged his horse into a slow walk, continuing his patrol. Celeste watched him go, a solitary figure against the vast, sun-bleached horizon. She saw a man bound by duty, wrapped in a solitude as profound as her own. The whispers started within the hour. As Celeste unpacked her belongings, the air itself seemed to carry the town's judgment, a Creole widow, all alone, past 40, they say. What's she thinking, setting up shop here? This is no place for an old colored woman to make her way. The words were a swarm of invisible insects, buzzing with the casual cruelty of small minds. Celeste had expected it. She had built a fortress around her heart long ago, brick by sturdy brick, but even the strongest walls could feel the vibration of such pervasive disdain. She feared not their words, but the box their words were building around her. Too old, too different, too alone. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. This one did not come with drunken taunts, but with a silken smile and clothes far too fine for the dusty streets. He was a man in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the soft hands of someone who did not engage in physical labor. He removed his hat as he approached, bowing slightly. Mrs. Beaumont. A pleasure. I am Silas Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, Celeste acknowledged, her eyes taking his measure. He reeked of money and sweet-talking ambition. I am a land agent, affiliated with the Blackwater and Pacific Railroad, he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. I heard of your arrival and simply had to come and offer my admiration. It takes a woman of considerable fortitude to establish herself in a place like this. It takes a woman with few other choices, Celeste corrected him gently. He chuckled. A rich, persuasive sound. Perhaps, but that is why I am here, to offer you a better one. This parcel of land, Mrs. Beaumont, it is arid, isolated, not suitable for a lady. The railroad, however, has a vested interest in securing water rights in this area. That old well of yours, the Ojo Viejo, is of particular interest. I'm authorized to make you a very generous offer to take this burden off your hands. Celeste's gaze did not waver. Mr. Pritchard, I did not buy this land to be rid of it. I bought it to live on it. The well is not for sale. Silas's smile did not falter, but a cold glint appeared in his eyes. Every man and woman has a price. It is simply a matter of finding the right number. Think on it, a woman like you, with no husband to protect your interests. I have a deed, Mr. Pritchard, properly filed and notarized. That is all the protection I require." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then his smile returned, wider this time. A sharp one. "I admire that. It reminds me of your late husband, Antoine. He was a good man, a hard worker, did some survey work for one of my associate companies. As I recall, he understood the value of a good deal." The mention of her husband's name was a physical blow. It had been 2 years since the cholera took him on a wagon train heading west, 2 years since her world had been hollowed out. How did this man know Antoine the casual way he spoke of him, as if he were just another name in a ledger? Filled Celeste with a cold dread. The connection felt wrong, like a snake in a woodpile. "My husband is not part of this discussion," she said, her voice tight. "The land is not for sale. Good day, Mr. Pritchard." Silas Pritchard placed his hat back on his head, his smile finally gone, replaced by a mask of cool appraisal. "As you wish, but the railroad is patient, and it always gets what it wants." He turned and walked away, leaving Celeste with the bitter taste of his veiled threat and the unsettling mystery of his connection to her past. That night, the simmering tension of the drought finally boiled over. A calf went missing from the small herd of a local Mexican rancher, Miguel Romero. It was a small thing, but in a town where every head of livestock, every drop of water, was precious. It was enough to spark a fire. Romero, his face a mask of fury, stood in the sheriff's office, accusing a homesteader family, the Millers, whose land bordered his own. Jude listened patiently. His deputy, Wade Harlan, standing by his side. Harlan was a young man, ambitious and eager, with a cruel streak he mistook for strength. "We should ride out there and string Miller up." "Sheriff," Harlan urged, "teach these squatters a lesson about thieving." Jude ignored him. He looked at Romero. "You have proof, Miguel." "They are starving," Romero spat. "That is proof enough." Jude took his hat from the rack. "Let's ride out. Wade, you stay here." He preferred to handle these things alone. Harlan's idea of justice was too loud and too simple. He found the Miller homestead just as Romero had described a pathetic sod house and a family with hunger etched into their faces. He did not go in with accusations. He dismounted, approached Mr. Miller, and spoke quietly. He talked about the drought, about hard times, about how a community had to hold together or it would fall apart, and in the end, the truth came out. Not with a shout, but with a shame-faced whisper. They had been starving. The calf had been taken. When Jude returned to town, he did not have Miller in chains. He had a deal. Miller would work for Romero for 2 months to pay for the calf. Jude had also spoken to the man at the general store, convincing him to extend the Millers a line of credit for flour and beans, with the sheriff himself standing as guarantor. Harlan was furious. "You let him off, Sheriff. People will think you are soft." Jude sat down at his desk, the lamplight carving deep shadows on his face. He felt the familiar weight of his own past failure settle on his shoulders. A year ago, a bank robbery had gone wrong. His wife, Eleanor, had been caught in the crossfire. He had followed the letter of the law, had waited for backup instead of acting, and she had died. Since that day, the law had felt like a hollow thing to him, a set of rules that could not account for the messy, desperate reality of human lives. "The law is meant to serve justice." "Wade," Jude said, his voice low and tired. "It's not a club to beat the poor with. Romero gets his payment, the Miller family doesn't starve, and the town stays quiet for another night. That is justice." He stared out the window into the darkness, his thoughts drifting to the new woman at the edge of town. A woman hammering her claim into the hard earth, facing down drunks and land sharks with a quiet strength he recognized. He felt a strange, unwelcome kinship with her. 2 solitary souls, both too old to start over, trying to make a stand in a world that seemed determined to grind them into dust. the red dust of Dusty Mesa. The morning sun did little to burn off the chill of the previous night's tensions. For 2 days, an uneasy quiet settled over Dusty Mesa, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Celeste worked, establishing a rhythm to her new life. She mended a torn shirt for a ranch hand, her stitches small and even, and mixed a sage and willow bark tincture for an elderly woman's aching joints. She was building a reputation, one small act of service at a time. Her small herd of 6 goats, purchased with the last of her traveling money, provided milk and a comforting, familiar presence. They were her small stake in the future. The storm broke on the 3rd day. It arrived not with thunder, but with the arrogant stride of Silas Pritchard. This time, he was not alone. Deputy Wade Harlan walked beside him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a swagger in his step that spoke of borrowed authority. They stopped before Celeste's cabin, their shadows falling long and ominous in the afternoon light. "Good day, Mrs. Beaumont," Silas began, his tone oozing a false cordiality. He held up a piece of paper. "I have here an official order of requisition." Celeste stepped out onto her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes flickered from the paper to Harlan's smug face. "An order for what?" "For the Ojo Viejo." "Of course," Silas said, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "The town council, in light of the worsening drought, has deemed it a critical public resource for the common good. It must be placed under municipal management." Harlan stepped forward. "Which means we're sealing the well. It's for the town. Ma'am, you can't just hoard all that water for yourself." Celeste felt a cold fury rise within her, but she kept her voice steady. "Precise. This is private property. Deputy, I have the deed, and I have not hoarded a single drop. Anyone who has asked for water has received it." "That's not the point," Silas interjected smoothly, handing the paper to Harlan. "The point is the law. This document gives the town the authority to assume control. It is a matter of public utility." Celeste held out her hand. "May I see that?" Harlan hesitated, then thrust the paper at her. She took it, her eyes scanning the text. It was filled with legalistic jargon, words designed to intimidate and confuse. But then she saw it at the bottom. Pressed into the paper, the official seal of the town of Dusty Mesa, a circle with a simple rendering of the surrounding mesas. It looked real, but the signature was a scrawl she did not recognize, and the entire premise felt like a lie. "This is not a legal document," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It is a fabrication." She marched back into her cabin and returned a moment later with a leather satchel. From it, she produced her own papers, the deed of sale, the survey, all duly signed and stamped by the circuit judge in Santa Fe. "This," she said, holding them up, "is the law. This land, and the well upon it, belongs to me. You have no authority here." Harlan's face flushed with anger. "Are you resisting a lawful order?" He took a step onto her porch. Before he could take another, a voice cut through the air. "That's far enough! Wade!" Sheriff Jude Callahan had rounded the corner on his patrol. He dismounted slowly, his gaze moving from Harlan's aggressive posture to the papers in Celeste's hands, and finally to Silas Pritchard, who watched the proceedings with an air of detached amusement. "What's going on here?" Jude asked, his voice low and even. "Just carrying out the town's orders, Sheriff," Harlan said, puffing out his chest. "We're securing this well for the public, on account of the drought." He handed Jude the requisition order. Jude took it, his expression unreadable as he studied the document. He ran a thumb over the embossed seal. It was the town's seal. All right. He had used the press in his office 100 times, but the logic of the order felt twisted. The town had never seized private property like this before. He then looked at the papers Celeste held. He knew a legitimate deed when he saw one. He was trapped. On one hand, a document that bore the town's official mark, presented by his own deputy. On the other, a woman's legally certified property rights. His mind raced. To ignore the order would be to undermine his own office's authority. To enforce it would be to commit a profound injustice. He was caught between the procedure of the law and the spirit of the law. And the memory of his wife's death reminded him how deadly that gap could be. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said, his voice heavy with a reluctance that felt like a betrayal. "This seal, it is authentic. I cannot ignore it." Celeste's heart sank. "Sheriff, you know this is wrong. That man wants my land, and he is using you to take it." "What I know is that I have two conflicting legal claims," Jude said, avoiding her eyes, "until I can verify the legitimacy of this order with the circuit judge. I have to secure the site. It is the only way to keep the peace for now." "Secure the site," she repeated, her voice incredulous. "You mean you are going to close my well based on this piece of paper from a thief and his puppet?" The accusation stung. "I'm going to put a temporary seal on it," Jude said, his tone hardening. "I will send a wire to Santa Fe in the morning. This will be sorted out. Wade, bring the rope and the wax from my office." Harlan grinned, a flash of triumph in his eyes. As he left, Silas Pritchard gave Celeste a look of mock sympathy. "A shame, Mrs. Beaumont, but the law is the law." Celeste looked at Jude, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that made him feel like a coward. "You are not upholding the law, Sheriff. You are hiding behind it." He had no answer for her. He stood there, a man of rules in a situation that demanded wisdom, and watched as his deputy returned. Together, they wrapped a heavy rope around the well's windlass and frame. Jude took the block of red wax and, using a match, melted it a large dollop onto the knot. Pressing the town seal firmly into it, the act felt final, a monument to his own failure. He had not protected her. He had locked away her lifeline. That night, a sliver of moon offered little light and no comfort inside her cabin. Celeste sat in the dark, the sting of injustice a bitter poison in her soul. She could not sleep. A strange noise from the goat pen, a soft, distressed bleating, drew her outside. The scene that greeted her in the lantern light was a nightmare. One of her goats lay on its side, its body convulsing. Another was down, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. The water trough was tainted with a greasy, iridescent sheen. Poison. A cold, calculated cruelty designed not just to harm her, but to destroy her hope. Grief and fury warred within her. For a moment, she wanted to scream, to rail at the uncaring stars. Then, the healer took over. She would not let them win. She would not let this darkness extinguish her. Working with a desperate urgency, she brought fresh water from her personal barrel inside the cabin. She gathered herbs from her store's charcoal to absorb the poison, milk thistle for the liver, slippery elm to soothe their tortured stomachs. She ground them into a paste, mixing it with water to create a drench. One by one, she knelt by her suffering animals, forcing the remedy down their throats. She worked through the night, her hands stained with medicine and dirt, whispering words of encouragement to the frightened creatures. By dawn, 3 of her 6 goats were dead, but 3 others were alive. They stood on shaky legs, weak but breathing steadily. She had saved them. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the yard, people began to arrive. They did not come in a crowd, but one by one, in a slow, hesitant trickle. A Mexican woman whose baby was racked with fever, an old prospector with a cough that shook his frail body, a young mother whose own milk had dried up because of the drought. They had heard about the poisoned goats, but they had also heard of the woman who knew the old ways, the one who could make medicine from the earth. They came seeking help. The woman with the sick baby looked at Celeste's exhausted face, at the small, pathetic graves she had dug for her goats. "We are sorry for your trouble, ma'am," she said in Spanish, "but my little one, she burns with fire." Celeste looked at the faces gathered in her yard, faces lined with poverty and worry. She saw her own struggle reflected in their eyes, and in that moment, her personal anger transformed into a shared resolve. Silas Pritchard and his corrupted law had sealed her well to take it from her. But it was never just hers. It belonged to the land, to the people who were thirsty. She walked to the Ojo Viejo, the red wax seal a glaring symbol of the injustice done to her. She picked up the heavy mallet she had used to hammer in her sign. With a single, decisive blow, she shattered the seal. The sound of the wood cracking echoed in the morning stillness. She unwound the rope, dropped the bucket into the cool darkness, and began to draw water. She poured a cup for the woman with the feverish child. "Give her this to drink," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Then bring her inside. I have something for the fever." One by one, they came forward with their buckets and their jars. Celeste Beaumont, the woman they said was too old and too different, stood by her well, the source of life, and gave it freely to the community. It was an act of defiance, an act of compassion, and an act of war. The battle for the Ojo Viejo and for the soul of Dusty Mesa had just begun. News of the broken seal traveled faster than a prairie fire. By noon, Sheriff Jude Callahan stood in the doorway of his stone office, watching the slow but steady procession to Celeste Beaumont's cabin. He saw the Romero family with a side of cured pork, the Miller boy with a promise of 2 days' labor mending her fence, and old Widow Maeve offering a basket of late-season squash. Celeste was not selling water. She was nurturing a community, bartering life itself for scraps of food and labor. She had created a water market born of necessity and fairness, and in doing so, had become the town's unsanctioned, undeniable heart. Jude felt a knot of shame tighten in his gut. His seal, his law, had been shattered by an act of simple decency. He turned back into his office, the air cool and silent. His deputy, Wade Harlan, was polishing a rifle, whistling a tuneless, cheerful melody that grated on Jude's nerves. "Something on your mind?" Sheriff Harlan asked without looking up. "The town seal," Jude said, his voice casual. "I needed it yesterday for some freight papers. Could not find it on my desk." Harlan stopped whistling. He set the rifle down with a deliberate care. "Is that so? Well, I have not seen it. You know how things get buried under paperwork." His denial was too quick, his gaze too shifty. Jude walked to the heavy oak press that stood in the corner of the office. He ran his hand over the mechanism, then opened the small drawer at its base where the metal die was kept. It was empty. "Funny," Jude said, his voice still level. "I always keep it right here. You were the last one to lock up 2 nights ago." "Were not you?" "I suppose I was," Harlan said, his face hardening. "Are you accusing me of something, Sheriff A?" "I am asking a question, Deputy," Jude replied, turning to face him. He saw the flicker of guilt in Harlan's eyes, quickly masked by defiance. Jude knew. He did not have proof that would stand up in court, but he had the certainty of a man who knew his own men. Harlan had taken the seal for Silas Pritchard. The rot in his own office went deeper than he had feared. Jude decided to let the matter rest, for now. A cornered rat was dangerous, and he needed more than just a missing seal. He needed to see the rat's next move. He found his chance that evening, under the guise of checking her legal papers again. He rode out to Celeste's cabin. The yard was quiet now, the last of the day's supplicants having departed. Celeste was sitting on her porch step, mending a tear in a canvas tarp. "Sheriff," she said, her voice cool, not hostile but wary. "Mrs. Beaumont," he acknowledged, swinging down from his horse. He held out a hand. "May I see your deed again? I need to make a more detailed copy of the surveyor's notes for my report to the circuit judge." It was a flimsy pretext, but she seemed to understand it for what it was an offering, an admission that he was on her side. She retrieved the papers for him. As he copied the details into his notebook, He spoke in a low voice. The requisition order was fraudulent, but the seal was real. I am looking into it. He did not look up from his work. Be careful. Pritchard is not a man who gives up easily. I have discovered that, she said quietly, her fingers stilling on the canvas. My goats discovered it first. The simple statement hit Jude harder than any accusation. I am sorry for that, he said, and the words felt horribly inadequate. He finished his notes and handed the deed back to her. Your papers are solid, but in a place like this, sometimes the law needs a little help to stand up straight. Their eyes met for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. He was telling her he would be that help. Before either of them could say more, a change in the air stole their attention. The relentless sun had dimmed, and the sky to the west was turning a sickly yellow-brown. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, began to pick up, carrying with it a strange, mournful sound. Sandstorm, Celeste said, her voice tight with a new kind of alarm. She stood up, her eyes scanning the horizon, and a bad one, by the looks of it, as if summoned by her words. A line of riders appeared on the ridge overlooking her property. There were 5 of them, their faces covered with bandanas, their figures dark against the churning, dusty sky. They were not cowboys or ranchers. They moved with a predatory purpose, their goal unmistakable, the well. Get inside, Jude said, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. That well is my life, Celeste replied, her chin set in a stubborn line. I am not abandoning it. The riders spurred their horses, beginning their descent just as the first great wall of sand hit the town. The world dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos. Day turned to a suffocating twilight. Sand, sharp as ground glass, lashed at their skin and filled their mouths. The air was thick, each breath a struggle. Through the maelstrom, Jude could hear shouts from the town. People were running for cover, doors slamming against the fury of the wind. But some were running toward the Ojo Viejo. Miguel Romero appeared out of the brown haze, his face wrapped in a wet cloth. The Miller boy was right behind him, followed by a handful of others. They had seen the riders. They knew what this was about. They will try to fill it in, Romero shouted over the howl of the wind. We cannot let them. The riders were closer now, disoriented by the storm but still pressing forward. Celeste grabbed the large canvas tarp she had been mending. This, she yelled, her voice barely audible. We have to cover the well. It was a desperate, almost impossible idea. The tarp was huge and heavy, and the wind was a living thing, a giant hand trying to tear it from their grasp. Jude took one corner, Romero another. They fought to drag it toward the well, the fabric whipping and snapping like a cannon shot. Hold on, Jude roared. He was no longer a sheriff weighing legalities. He was a man defending a barricade. He became a wall against the wind, his boots sinking into the shifting ground, his muscles straining. Celeste was right beside him, her slight frame braced against the gale, her grip on the canvas unrelenting. For a moment, their hands brushed, a brief point of contact in the swirling chaos, and a jolt of warmth passed between them, a strange and potent reassurance. The riders reached them, emerging from the dust like phantoms. One of them pulled a pistol, but aiming in the blinding storm was impossible. They were here for sabotage, not a gunfight. Another swung a shovel from his saddle, trying to get close to the well. The Miller boy, armed with nothing but courage, tackled him, sending them both tumbling into the dirt. Jude and Celeste struggled with the tarp, their faces raw from the sand. The wind caught a loose edge, threatening to tear the whole thing away and send it flying into the unknown. They were losing. Together, Celeste gasped, her voice hoarse. On 3 pull. She counted, her voice lost to the wind. But they all seemed to feel the rhythm. They pulled as one, a surge of collective will against the power of the storm. The canvas moved, inch by agonizing inch, until it finally covered the stone mouth of the Ojo Viejo. They collapsed onto its edges, using their bodies as anchors, the wind screaming over them. One of the masked riders, frustrated and blinded, spurred his horse too hard. The animal panicked in the disorienting gale, lost its footing, and went down with a terrified scream. The rider was thrown hard, his head hitting the stone rim of the well. His bandana was torn away in the fall. Jude, shielding his eyes, crawled closer. In the dim swirling light, he recognized the face. It was Emmett Pritchard, Silas's younger cousin, a man known more for his drinking and gambling than for honest work. The connection was undeniable. The other riders, seeing their companion fall and the well protected by a stubborn wall of humanity, gave up. They were shadows swallowed by the storm as quickly as they had appeared. The sandstorm raged for what felt like an eternity. Huddled under the meager shelter of the cabin's overhang, pinned down by the wind, were Celeste, Jude, Romero, and the others who had come to help. They were a small, battered alliance, their faces caked with mud formed from dust and sweat. Emmett Pritchard lay groaning by the well, his leg broken in the fall. In a lull in the wind's deafening roar, Jude looked at Celeste. Her hair was wild. Her face was streaked with grime, but her eyes were clear and fierce. "This dust," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "makes a poor substitute for water." A smile touched her cracked lips. It was a small, exhausted thing, but it lit up her face. "It does," she agreed, "but it seems to show you who is willing to get thirsty for their neighbors." He held her gaze. In that moment, surrounded by the raw and violent power of nature and the ugliness of human greed, he saw her not as a problem to be managed by the law, but as a force of nature in her own right. The storm outside was no match for the storm of will inside this woman, a feeling he had not allowed himself to have for a very long time, a flicker of something warm and bright, sparked in the cold, lonely chambers of his heart. When the wind finally died down hours later, it left behind a world transformed. The sky was a bruised purple, and a thick blanket of red dust covered everything, softening the hard edges of the town. The well, beneath its canvas shield, was safe. The community, huddled together against two different kinds of storms, was still standing. The wind had stripped away pretenses and revealed the true character of everyone in Dusty Mesa. And for Jude Callahan, it had blown away some of the dust that had settled on his own soul, allowing him to see clearly for the first time in a very long time. The aftermath of the sandstorm left Dusty Mesa in a state of muted awe. A fragile truce seemed to hold, born of shared hardship. Jude Callahan, however, knew that the peace was as thin as the layer of dust on his desk. He had a prisoner, Emmett Pritchard, locked in one of the two cells, his broken leg crudely splinted and his bravado shattered. He was Jude's first and most important loose thread. Jude let Emmett stew in misery for a full day before he visited him. He did not bring threats. He brought a clean bandage and a tin cup of Celeste's willow bark tea for the pain. He set them down just outside the cell bars. "Your cousin has not come to see you." "Emmett," Jude began, his voice quiet, "has not sent a message, has not even asked if you are alive or dead." Emmett glared at him from the cot. "He's a busy man." "He is," Jude agreed, leaning against the cold stone wall. "Busy enough to hire 5 men to destroy a woman's well. Busy enough to leave one of them behind when things went sour. Tell me, what were you promised for the work?" "I ain't saying nothing," Emmett mumbled, but his eyes darted nervously toward the tea. "Was it enough to pay for a doctor enough to see you through a winter on a broken leg? Because Silas has not paid me a visit to cover your expenses? It seems you have been forgotten." Jude picked up the cup. "This tea will help with the throbbing. Mrs. Beaumont made it herself. Seems she holds less of a grudge than your own family." He started to turn away. "Wait!" Emmett's voice was a croak. "He paid us $20 each." Jude stopped. $20 to risk getting shot or trampled in a sandstorm. He values you cheaply." He paused, letting the silence hang. "Who told you the well would be unguarded? Who told you I would not be there?" Emmett hesitated. Then the bitterness of his abandonment spilled over. "Harlan, Deputy Harlan. He said the sheriff was too busy wrestling with his conscience to bother with a single well at the edge of town. He said we had a clear run." There it was, the link. Jude pushed the cup of tea through the bars. "Drink up, Emmett. It's going to be a long winter." The next piece came from a quiet conversation with the bartender at the saloon. Jude nursed a lukewarm beer and asked about Harlan's recent spending habits. The bartender, a man named Alf, polished a glass and spoke in a low voice. "Funny you should ask. Sheriff, Wade's been mighty free with his silver lately. Bought a round for the whole bar 2 nights back, paid with shiny silver dollars. Usually it is scrip and a running tab for that one." Silver dollars. That was Silas Pritchard's currency of choice. Jude thanked Alf and left, the pieces clicking into place. The final piece was the seal itself. That night, long after Harlan had gone home, Jude lit a lantern and conducted a thorough, methodical search of his deputy's desk. Tucked inside a hollowed-out book titled Principles of Justice, he found it, the cold, heavy metal die of the town of Dusty Mesa. The confrontation came the next morning. Snow was falling outside, the first of the season, each flake a soft, white speck against the gray sky. It deadened the sound from the street, making the sheriff's office feel like a sealed chamber. "I found the town seal. Wade," Jude said without preamble. He placed it on the desk between them. Harlan, who had been cleaning his pistol, froze. "It was in your desk. I also have a statement from Emmett Pritchard saying you were the one who guaranteed the sheriff would not interfere with their work. And Alf at the saloon tells me you have come into some money." Harlan slowly set down his pistol. His face, usually a mask of smug confidence, was pale. He tried to bluff. "Emmett's a liar, and I won a lucky hand at poker." "There was no poker game that night," Jude said, his voice flat. "You took money from Silas Pritchard to steal the town seal and to look the other way while his men committed a felony. That makes you an accessory. I am stripping you of your badge, and I am placing you under arrest." Harlan stared at him, cornered. The fear in his eyes slowly curdled into a venomous, sneering hatred. He decided to play his last, and most vicious, card. He stood up, his voice rising, loud enough to be heard through the door. "You are arresting me." "For what for? Trying to uphold an order from the town council. This is not about any seal, and you know it. This is about that woman." "This is about the law," Jude said, his own voice dangerously low. "Is it?" Harlan shot back, a contemptuous smirk twisting his lips. "Or is it that you have taken a shine to the old Creole widow? Everyone in town has seen the way you look at her. You let her break your seal. You defended her against good, white citizens. Now you are arresting your own deputy to protect her. You are not upholding the law. Sheriff, you are letting a black woman lead you around by the nose." The accusation, raw and ugly, hung in the air. It was a poison dart, aimed not at the facts but at the deepest prejudices of the town. Jude felt a cold rage wash over him, but he held it in check. He knew that any display of anger would only feed the lie. He simply pointed to the cell. "Get in, Wade." But the damage was done. The door opened and the town clerk, a nervous man named Abernathy, peeked in, his eyes wide. He had heard every word. Within the hour, the accusation was all over town. A foul whisper carried on the falling snow. Sheriff Callahan, they said, was compromised. He was showing favor. He was not impartial. Silas Pritchard demanded an emergency meeting of the town council. It was held that afternoon in the small, pine-paneled room behind the general store. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, fighting a losing battle against the chill seeping through the walls. Outside, the world was turning white. Jude stood before the 3 councilmen Pritchard, whose face was a mask of sober concern, a rancher named Thompson, a hard but fair man, and Henderson, the owner of the general store, a man who valued profit above all else. Jude laid out his evidence against Harlan calmly and logically. "This is a simple matter of corruption," he concluded. "My deputy took a bribe to aid in a crime." Silas Pritchard spoke, his voice dripping with false regret. "A crime or a clumsy attempt to enforce a valid town order. Sheriff, your personal feelings seem to have clouded your judgment. Your deputy claims you are acting not out of duty, but out of a personal attachment to Mrs. Beaumont." "My personal feelings have nothing to do with it," Jude stated, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Wade Harlan is a corrupt officer of the law." "And what of Mrs. Beaumont Henderson?" The merchant chimed in. "She openly defied a legal seal. She is dispensing water and creating unrest. My business is down because people are bartering with her instead of using cash at my store." The room was divided. Thompson, the rancher, seemed to believe Jude, but the accusation of favoritism had found fertile ground with Henderson. Pritchard fanned the flames, painting a picture of a sheriff who had lost his objectivity, a man putting the interests of an outsider, a black woman, above the needs of the town. Jude felt as though he were sinking in quicksand. The truth was right there, but their prejudice was blinding them to it. His badge, pinned to his chest, felt heavy and cold. He could feel a crack running through it, a fissure in the very idea of the justice he was sworn to uphold. Just as the argument reached its peak, the door to the meeting room opened. A cold gust of wind swept in, and with it, 3 figures. They were Mescalero Apache. The man in the lead was old, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his long gray hair braided with beads. He carried himself with an authority that instantly silenced the room. "I am Nantan," the elder said, his voice deep and resonant. "We have come to speak of the Ojo Viejo." Pritchard was the first to recover. "This is a private meeting. This land dispute does not concern you." Nantan's dark eyes fixed on him. "The well you call the Old Eye was watered by the tears of our ancestors long before the first white man saw this land. It is a sacred place. It belongs to the people. Our claim is older than any piece of paper you may hold." The room was thrown into a new state of chaos. Another claimant to the well. Henderson sputtered about property laws, while Thompson looked on with a thoughtful, troubled expression. Then the door opened again. Celeste Beaumont stood there, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl against the snow. She had been summoned by Romero, who had seen the Mescalero arrive. She walked into the center of the room, her presence calm and steadying. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "the people who come to me for water have no cash. Would you rather they simply perished? And Mr. Pritchard, your concern for the public good is touching, considering you sent armed men to destroy the very resource you claim to want to protect." She then turned to the Mescalero elder and inclined her head respectfully. "Nantan, I honor the history of your people. The well saved my life, and I have used it to help my neighbors. I do not claim to own the water. I claim the right to live on the land my husband's last wages paid for, and to be a good steward of the life it provides." Her words, full of simple dignity and unassailable logic, shifted the atmosphere in the room. She was not arguing ownership in the way the white men were. She was speaking of responsibility. "Let us share it," she proposed, looking from Nantan to the councilmen. "A council, with a representative from the town and one from your people, can oversee its use, to ensure it is used fairly by all, for drinking and for life, not for profit." It was a revolutionary idea. Pritchard scoffed. "Absurd. We cannot cede control to them." But Thompson was listening. The woman speaks with reason. Nantan watched Celeste, his expression thoughtful. He had seen the truth of her words in the way she had helped the poor of the town, regardless of their race. But he had not yet played his final card. "The woman of the Beaumont house speaks with a good heart," he said, his gaze finally shifting to Silas Pritchard. "But the man from the railroad does not. He seeks to own the Ojo Viejo not for its water, but to deny it to others." He paused, letting his words sink in. "My scouts have seen his men, 2 miles upstream, in the canyons. They are digging a new well, a deep one. They are not looking for new water. They are looking for the source, the mother vein that feeds the Ojo Viejo. He means to steal the heart of the well and leave you all with nothing but a dry hole." A stunned silence fell over the room. Jude looked at Pritchard, whose face had gone pale. The land agent's entire scheme was laid bare: create a water crisis, seize control of the only known source, and then, once he had secretly diverted the spring that fed it, sell the town a permanent dependency on the railroad's water. It was a plan of breathtaking evil. The first snow of winter continued to fall, blanketing the town in a deceptive purity. But inside the small room, the ugly truth had been exposed. The battle was no longer just about one woman's property. It was about the survival of everyone in the valley. And justice had just become a much more complicated and dangerous proposition. Nantan's revelation fell upon the council room like a stone dropped into a still pond. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of snow against the window panes. Silas Pritchard's face was a study in controlled fury, his composure finally cracking to reveal the predatory greed beneath. He opened his mouth to issue a denial, but the truth of the accusation was so audacious, so complete, that no lie seemed adequate to cover it. The meeting dissolved without conclusion, the councilmen retreating into muttered consultations, their alliances fractured. But for Jude, Celeste, and Nantan, the path forward was suddenly terrifyingly clear. They were no longer on the defensive, reacting to Pritchard's schemes. They had to seize the initiative. They had to find the proof. That night, under a sliver of a moon that cast the snow-dusted landscape in shades of silver and black, a small party rode out from the shelter of the town. There was Jude, his face grim, his senses on high alert. There was Celeste, a rifle she had not handled in years resting in the scabbard of her borrowed saddle. And leading them were 2 of Nantan's most trusted men, Chaco and Baishan. Warriors who moved through the treacherous, broken country with a silent grace that made them seem a part of the land itself. They followed a narrow, winding canyon carved by an ancient river, the towering rock walls blotting out the sky. The only sounds were the crunch of their horses' hooves in the snow and the whisper of the wind through the piñon pines. The cold was a physical presence, sharp and biting, seeping into their bones. Celeste pulled her shawl tighter, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She felt a knot of fear in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a cold, clear sense of purpose. For the first time since arriving in Dusty Mesa, she was not simply enduring, she was fighting back. After nearly 2 hours of riding, Chaco held up a hand, bringing the group to a halt. He dismounted and crept forward, melting into the shadows. He returned a moment later, his expression grim. "They are there," he whispered. "2 men, they guard the machine." They left the horses tethered in a thicket of juniper and proceeded on foot. The air grew thick with the unfamiliar, acrid smell of coal smoke and hot metal. As they rounded a massive buttress of red rock, they saw it. A deep, raw wound had been gouged into the earth. At its center stood a monstrous iron contraption, a steam-powered pump, its black metal belly still warm from its day's work. A network of pipes snaked away from it, disappearing into the darkness. A crude wooden shed stood nearby, a faint line of light showing beneath its door. This was Pritchard's secret, his weapon. This machine was designed to suck the very lifeblood from the earth, to drain the Ojo Viejo and hold the entire valley hostage. The sight of it was a profound violation, a brutal scarring of the sacred land. Jude formulated a plan in a series of urgent, whispered gestures. Baishan would circle around to watch their backs. Chaco would deal with the guard outside the shed. Jude and Celeste would handle the one inside and search for evidence. Chaco moved with the fluid silence of a hunting cat. There was a brief, muffled scuffle, a soft thud, and then silence. He gave a low whistle, the call of a night bird. It was the signal. Jude drew his pistol, the click of the hammer seeming thunderous in the stillness. He and Celeste crept to the shed door. With a shared nod, Jude kicked the door open. A man was sitting at a small table, a half-eaten plate of beans before him, a startled look on his face. He lunged for a rifle leaning against the wall, but Jude was faster. The barrel of Jude's pistol pressing against his temple stopped him cold. Celeste moved swiftly to the table, her eyes scanning its surface, and there it was, pinned beneath a rock. A set of rolled-up schematics. She snatched them and unrolled them in the dim lantern light. It was a detailed drawing of the pump, the well shaft, and the network of pipes. It was the proof they needed. Then her eyes fell to the bottom right corner of the page, in a neat, block-printed title box. She read the words Blackwater and Pacific Railroad, Western Territories Water Development Project. A line for an authorized signature was signed with a confident, looping script, Silas Pritchard. "Jude," she whispered, her voice tight with the terrible significance of her discovery. "It is the railroad. It is all of them." Pritchard was not just a greedy land agent. He was a corporate soldier. And Dusty Mesa was not just a town. It was an asset to be conquered. The knowledge landed with the weight of a physical blow. Their fight was not with one man, but with a faceless, powerful entity with limitless resources. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet splintering the door frame inches from Jude's head. Baishan shouted a warning from the darkness. They had been discovered. More men were coming. There was no time for questions. Jude brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the guard's head, knocking him unconscious. "We have to go. Now." They burst out of the shed and ran for the horses, Celeste clutching the precious schematics to her chest. Gunshots echoed through the canyon, the bullets whining off the rocks around them. They scrambled onto their horses, the animals skittish and wild-eyed with fear. They galloped back the way they had come, Chaco and Baishan firing back into the darkness to cover their retreat. The chase was a frantic, terrifying blur. They were riding blind, trusting their horses' instincts on the treacherous, snow-slicked ground. The canyon walls amplified the sounds of the pursuit, making it seem as if their enemies were everywhere at once. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Jude's coat. Another kicked up a spray of rock and ice beside Celeste's horse. They rounded a sharp bend, the narrow canyon floor falling away into a series of rocky ledges. Jude's horse, its eyes rolling in terror, lost its footing on a patch of ice. It went down with a high, wrenching scream. Celeste pulled back hard on her own reins, her horse rearing as she fought to avoid a collision. For a heart-stopping moment, she was suspended at the edge of the precipice. Then, her own horse stumbled, and the world tilted violently. She was falling. The ground rushed up to meet her. In that split second, she saw Jude, thrown clear of his own horse, lunging toward her. He wrapped his arms around her, twisting his body in mid-air. His solid form was the last thing she felt before they hit the ground. They landed in a deep, dry wash 15 feet below the trail, the impact a jarring explosion of pain that knocked the breath from her lungs. They rolled, a tangle of limbs, Jude's body absorbing the worst of the rocks and frozen earth. They came to a stop at the bottom of the gully, hidden from the trail above. Celeste lay there, dazed, the schematic still crushed in her hand. Hoofbeats thundered past on the trail above them, then slowly faded into the distance. They were alone. For a long moment, Celeste could not move. Her entire body ached. Then, a wave of cold, paralyzing shock washed over her. The violence, the fall, the proximity of death, it was too much. She felt herself shutting down, the world receding to a distant, humming noise. Her emotions froze solid, a protective layer of ice forming around her heart. A low groan from Jude broke through the fog. He was lying beside her, his face pale in the moonlight. He tried to push himself up and fell back with a sharp intake of breath. "Are you all right?" he gasped, his voice strained. She nodded, unable to speak. She sat up, her movement stiff, automatic. She saw the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his coat. Blood. The sight of it, stark and real, finally shattered her paralysis. The healer in her took command, pushing aside the fear. "You are hurt," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She crawled to his side. "Let me see." Carefully, she helped him sit up and eased the heavy coat off his shoulder. The bullet had not hit him cleanly. It had grazed his upper arm, tearing a ragged furrow through flesh and muscle. It was not a fatal wound, but it was deep and bleeding freely. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said, her mind working with a detached clarity. She tore a long strip from her petticoat, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. She packed the wound as best she could and bound it tightly. Jude gritted his teeth, his face beaded with sweat despite the cold, but he did not make a sound. They were trapped. His horse was gone, likely dead. Hers had bolted. They could not risk returning to the trail. All they could do was wait. They found a small alcove in the rock wall that offered some shelter from the wind. Using the last of their matches, Jude managed to start a small fire with some dry brush he found in the gully. The tiny blaze cast a circle of flickering light, a fragile haven in the vast, cold darkness. Celeste sat beside Jude, periodically checking his bandage. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken terror of what had just happened. She stared into the flames, her face a stoic mask, but inside, the ice around her heart was beginning to crack. She looked at him, at his pale, pain-lined face, at the blood-soaked bandage on his arm. He had thrown himself in front of her. He had taken the fall, taken the wound that was meant for her. No one had done anything like that for her in a very long time. "When the cholera came through our wagon train," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, "it took my husband, Antoine, but it took our son first." Jude turned to look at her, his expression softening with a deep, compassionate sorrow. He said nothing, sensing that she needed not words, but a willing ear. "His name was Samuel. He was 6 years old. He had my husband's smile." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, the first crack in the ice. "I was the one with the remedies, the one who was supposed to know how to heal. I made poultices, I brewed teas, I sat with him day and night, but the sickness was too strong. It burned right through him. I held him in my arms as he—" Her voice broke. "As he left us?" She took a shaky breath, the firelight glinting on her wet cheeks. "After that, after Antoine followed him 2 days later, I built a wall around myself. It felt safer that way. You work, you keep to yourself. You do not let anyone get close enough to hurt you. You do not let yourself hope for anything more than just getting through the day." She looked at Jude, her eyes filled with a vulnerability he had never seen before. "People look at me, and they see a widow, a woman of a certain age. They put a label on you. Too old to start over, too old to love again. And the loneliest part is that after a while, you start to believe it yourself. You start to think that maybe life only gives you one chance at happiness. And if you lose it, well, that is all there is." She fell silent, her confession hanging in the cold night air. She had shared the deepest, most guarded part of her soul. She had given him the source of her pain, the root of her fear. Jude reached out with his good hand and gently touched her arm. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply sat with her in her sorrow, his quiet, steady presence a balm on her wounded spirit. He had shielded her body from the fall, and now, with his silent compassion, he was shielding her heart as she dared to feel again. In the vast, uncaring wilderness, By the light of a dying fire, a stranger had become a witness, a protector, a man who had listened. And for Celeste Beaumont, that was a kindness more powerful and more terrifying than any bullet. Chaco and Baishan found them just after dawn, guided by a sixth sense for survival and the tracks of Celeste's panicked horse. The journey back to Dusty Mesa was a slow, painful affair. Jude, weak from blood loss and the biting cold, leaned heavily against Celeste in the saddle of a shared horse, the precious schematics tucked safely inside his shirt. They rode into town not as returning heroes, but as survivors, their faces grim, their bodies aching, bearing the proof of a war that had just begun. Celeste took him directly to her cabin. She worked with the quiet, focused intensity of a field surgeon, cleaning his wound with a carbolic soap solution that made him hiss with pain, then stitching the torn flesh with a fine, curved needle and silk thread. He watched her, his own pain a distant thrumming beneath the sharp, immediate sting of the needle. He saw the gentle sureness of her hands, the deep concentration in her eyes. She was not just mending his arm, she was mending the frayed edges of his hope. When she was done, she wrapped his arm in a clean bandage and gave him a potent draught of poppy tincture that finally allowed the exhaustion to claim him. While he slept, a new storm gathered, one of nature's making this time. The sky turned the color of a lead plate, and the wind began to howl, carrying the first stinging pellets of ice. It was a blizzard, a true monster of the high plains, descending on the town with a speed and fury that sent everyone scrambling for shelter. By nightfall, Dusty Mesa was entombed in a churning vortex of white. The temperature plummeted, and the town's main water pump, its iron heart exposed to the elements, froze solid and cracked. The town's water supply was gone. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind, set in. But then a light appeared, a single lantern, hung on the porch of Celeste Beaumont's cabin, a beacon in the blizzard. She had spent the day filling every barrel, bucket, and pot she owned from the Ojo Viejo. Her well, being a deep, earth-warmed spring, had not frozen. She had a reservoir of life, and she would not hoard it. A sign, hastily scrawled on a piece of wood, was nailed beside her door. Water. Free to all. Come. They came, huddled in thick coats and blankets, their faces wrapped against the biting wind. The people of Dusty Mesa formed a line in the snow, their fear momentarily abated by this unexpected act of grace. Silas Pritchard watched the scene from the window of the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He saw his carefully constructed crisis being dismantled by the generosity of the one woman who stood in his way. The schematics were missing. His cousin was in jail, and now this, he could not use the law, which had proven to be a clumsy tool, so he would use a more ancient and powerful weapon, fear. He walked out into the main room of the saloon, where a dozen or so of the town's most desperate and fearful men were gathered. "She plays you for fools," he roared over the sound of the wind. "Do you not see it?" He moved among them, his voice a venomous whisper. "First, her goats are poisoned, then a sandstorm, the likes of which we have not seen in years, is called down upon the men sent to secure the well for your benefit. Now, the town pump freezes, and miraculously, her well alone continues to flow. How is this possible?" He let the question hang in the air, letting their fear and superstition provide the answer. "It is witchery," a man finally muttered. "Of course it is." Silas seized on the word. "She uses her strange Creole herbs and potions to curse this town. She poisoned her own goats to gain your sympathy. She controls the weather. That is not spring water she is giving you. It is a trick, an enchantment to make you dependent on her. The well is cursed." The poison of his words spread through the room, taking root in the fertile ground of their terror. A mob, its courage fueled by cheap whiskey and righteous fear, was born, with Silas at its head. They plunged out into the blizzard, their lanterns swinging wildly, their shouts barely audible above the storm's roar. "Burn the witch, cleanse the well." Jude was woken by the noise. His arm throbbed, and his head was thick from the poppy tincture. But the sound of an angry crowd was a language he understood intimately. He looked out the window and saw the approaching lights. He grabbed his pistol with his good hand and went to the door. "Stay inside," he said to Celeste. "This is my job." He stepped out onto the porch, a lone figure standing between the mob and the woman they had come to destroy. The wind tore at his coat, and the snow stung his face. "Go back to your homes," he yelled, his voice a raw command. "There is no curse here, only a good woman helping her neighbors." "She has bewitched you," Sheriff someone shouted back. "You are under her spell." As Jude held the mob at bay with the sheer force of his will, two shadowy figures detached from the back of the crowd and slipped around the side of the cabin. They moved with a furtive haste, their destination the small shed where Celeste dried and stored her precious herbs. A moment later, a terrifying orange glow blossomed against the swirling white of the blizzard. The shed was on fire. "Fire," Celeste screamed from behind him, her voice filled with anguish. That she'd contained her livelihood, the tools of her healing, years of carefully gathered knowledge. The mob, momentarily distracted by the new spectacle, faltered. The fire was a primal fear, greater even than their fear of witchcraft. Jude was torn. He could not abandon his post, but he could not let her lose everything. Celeste did not hesitate. She grabbed 2 empty buckets and ran toward the well, Jude shouting her name into the wind. In that moment, he saw the mob for what it was, a pack of frightened children. The real threat was the fire. He fired his pistol into the air. The shot, sharp and definitive, shocked the crowd into a momentary stillness. "The fire will take the whole town if we do not stop it. Get buckets now." His authority, backed by the urgent reality of the flames, finally broke through their hysteria. The mob dissolved, its members becoming a frantic, disorganized bucket brigade. Jude rushed to Celeste's side at the well. Together, they worked, a desperate, rhythmic team. She would lower the bucket. He would use his good arm and shoulder to help her haul it up, his injured arm screaming in protest. They would pass the sloshing buckets down the line, their movements synchronized, their purpose singular. The heat was intense, the smoke acrid and choking. The wind fanned the flames, threatening to spread them to the cabin itself. Amid the chaos, a figure stood watching from the edge of the light, a smug, cruel smile on his face. Wade Harlan. He had been released from his cell by the council pending a full hearing, a decision pushed through by Pritchard. Jude saw him and felt a surge of pure, cold rage. He left the well and strode toward his former deputy, his pistol hanging loosely in his hand. "This was your work," Jude said, his voice a low growl. Harlan's smile widened. "Prove it." He had a small notebook and a pencil stub in his hand. In the flickering firelight, Jude saw him quickly jot something down before tucking it away. The man was a vulture, collecting scraps to be used for later. "One day," Jude said, stopping a few feet from him, the swirling snow and smoke creating a ghostly space around them, "you will run out of powerful men to hide behind." The fire, through their desperate efforts, was finally subdued, leaving the smoldering, blackened skeleton of the shed. The mob, their fever broken, had slunk away in shame. The blizzard still raged. Celeste and Jude stood in the aftermath, exhausted, soot-stained, and bone-weary. They retreated to the only nearby shelter that had survived unscathed, the small stable, where Celeste's 3 remaining goats were huddled, their eyes wide with fear. The stable was an oasis of warmth and quiet, the air thick with the sweet smell of hay and the comforting scent of the animals. A single candle in a hurricane lamp cast a gentle, flickering light. Jude sank down onto a hay bale, a violent shiver racking his body. It was the cold, the pain, and the utter depletion of his strength. Celeste took a heavy wool horse blanket from a peg and draped it over his shoulders. He looked up at her face smudged with soot, her hair tangled and wild, her eyes reflecting a sorrow so deep it stole his breath. She had lost so much tonight. He had been unable to protect her. The weight of his failure, of all his failures, settled on him. He watched as she went to one of the goats, murmuring softly to it, her hand stroking its neck to soothe its trembling. She was strength. She was compassion. She was life in a place that seemed hell-bent on death. "People have pinned the label 'too old to love again' on me," he said, his voice quiet, hoarse. The words came from a place he had kept locked away since his wife's death. He was echoing the fear she had confessed to him in the gully, the fear he now recognized as his own. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the soft light. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "But a widower like me knows the truth. My first marriage, we were children. We knew nothing of life, of loss. It was a kind of love. But it was not this." He took a shaky breath. "What I feel standing here with you, after all this, it is something else entirely. It is something I never knew existed." He met her gaze, and the walls he had built around his heart for a year finally came down. She was his first true romance, he said, the phrase a strange, formal piece of poetry that had lodged in his mind, the only words that seemed to fit the magnitude of what he felt. "Celeste, you are my first true romance." The confession, so simple, so profound, hung in the warm, quiet air between them. It was an offering of everything he was, a broken, grieving man who had, against all odds, found something whole. A small, wry smile touched Celeste's lips, a flicker of her indomitable spirit. "Well, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft but steady. "For a first romance, you certainly have a dramatic way of showing it." He managed a weak smile in return, the shared moment of humor. A tiny spark in the darkness was as intimate as a touch. She came to him then, closing the small space between them. She reached up and gently touched his cheek, her thumb brushing away a smudge of soot. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment. He had stood against mobs and fires and storms for her, but it was this small, gentle gesture that finally undid him. And then she leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation, but of quiet affirmation. It was as warm as the candlelight, as real as the scent of hay, a promise of shelter in the midst of the storm. It was the taste of hope, and it was enough. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world of profound silence, sculpted in white. For 3 days, Dusty Mesa was cut off, a town suspended in time, forced to contemplate the events that had transpired in the fire and the storm. It was a time of quiet accounting. The townsfolk who had formed the mob avoided Celeste's gaze, their shame a palpable presence in the cold air. But others, the Romeros, the Millers, the families she had given water to, sought her out, offering a shared cup of coffee, a mended blanket, a silent nod of respect. A new community was being forged in the crucible of the cold, one defined not by prejudice, but by shared survival. On the 4th day, the circuit judge arrived. His name was Alistair Blackwood, a man whose reputation for stern, impartial justice preceded him. He was a tall, gaunt figure who looked as though he had been carved from the same unforgiving landscape he administered, his face a weathered map of hard-won wisdom. He did not come alone. A United States Marshal flanked him, a clear sign that this would be no simple small-town hearing. The law had come to Dusty Mesa. The town's small church was cleared, its pews becoming spectator benches, the simple wooden altar draped with a purple cloth to serve as the judge's bench. The space, usually reserved for hymns and sermons, became an arena for a different kind of reckoning. Outside, a bitter wind rattled the window frames, a constant reminder of the harsh world that lay just beyond the reach of the law. The proceedings began. It was not one case, but a series of interconnected claims and counterclaims. On one side sat Silas Pritchard, flanked by a man who was clearly not from this part of the country. His name was Sterling, a lawyer from back east, dressed in a tailored wool suit, his face smooth and confident. On the other side sat a strange and unprecedented alliance. Celeste Beaumont was their clear leader. Beside her sat Nantan, the Mescalero elder, his posture radiating a timeless patience. Next to him was Miguel Romero and, surprisingly, the Anglo rancher Thompson, who had broken from the town council's other members. And at the end of their row sat Mr. Chen, the quiet, dignified owner of the town's small laundry and import shop, a man who rarely spoke in public but whose presence signified that the dispute had touched every corner of their diverse community. They had spent the days of the blizzard preparing. Their evidence was a carefully assembled fortress of truth. Celeste, speaking in a clear, steady voice that filled the silent church, presented their case. She began with the schematics they had taken from Pritchard's illegal drilling site. She unrolled the large sheet of paper on a table before the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "this is a plan, signed by Mr. Pritchard and authorized by the Blackwater and Pacific Railroad, to drill a well with a steam pump. Not just any well, but one positioned specifically to intercept the underground source of the Ojo Viejo spring." Sterling objected immediately. "This document was obtained illegally. Your Honor, it is the fruit of a criminal trespass." Judge Blackwood silenced him with a raised hand, his eyes fixed on the schematics. "I will determine what is and is not criminal here. Mr. Sterling, continue. Mrs. Beaumont." Celeste then produced a folded, oilskin-wrapped letter. This was tucked inside the roll of schematics. "Your Honor, it appears to be an internal railroad company communique." She unfolded it and read aloud. "The successful diversion of the Ojo Viejo aquifer will create a state of perpetual municipal dependency, making the township of Dusty Mesa an ideal site for the planned ore processing plant and ensuring a compliant workforce. They did not just want to steal the water. Your Honor, they wanted to enslave the town." A low murmur rippled through the crowded church. This was not about a single well anymore. It was about the very future and freedom of their home. Their final, and most volatile, piece of evidence was a witness. Jude Callahan, his arm in a clean sling, called his former deputy, Wade Harlan, to the stand. Harlan had been offered a deal the truth in exchange for a recommendation of leniency. He slouched in the witness chair, his eyes burning with a resentful fire. But the fear of a long prison sentence was a powerful motivator. "Did Silas Pritchard pay you to assist in his efforts to secure the Ojo Viejo?" Jude asked, his voice ringing with official authority. Harlan mumbled, "Yes." "And what did he pay you to do?" "He paid me to borrow the town seal for the requisition order. He paid me to look the other way when his men went to discourage Mrs. Beaumont, and he paid me to stir up trouble about her." "To stir up trouble, how?" Harlan's gaze flickered toward Celeste. "By saying she was a witch, by saying the well was cursed. It was his idea to start the fire." He then produced a small, grimy notebook from his pocket, the one he had been writing in the night of the fire. "I kept a record of our meetings, the dates, the amounts he paid me. It is all in here." He had been gathering insurance, ready to blackmail his master if necessary. Now, it was his only lifeline. The case against Pritchard was damning, but Mr. Sterling was a skilled tactician. He knew he could not win on the facts, so he attacked the character of the woman who had brought them to light. He called Celeste to the stand. "Mrs. Beaumont," he began, his voice smooth and condescending. "You portray yourself as a victim. Yet is it not true that you are the one who has consistently created unrest in this town since your arrival?" "I have created nothing but a life for myself." "Mr. Sterling," Celeste replied, her voice calm. "A life or a public nuisance. Did you or did you not?" On the morning after the sheriff lawfully sealed your well, take a mallet and willfully destroy the town seal, an act of open defiance against the law. I broke a piece of wax that was being used to support a lie. Celeste corrected him. I did it to give water to a woman whose baby was dying of fever. If that is a crime, then I am guilty. Sterling paced before her. And this system of barter you established, you used this well, the very subject of this dispute, to create your own private economy, undermining the good merchants of this town, like Mr. Henderson. Is that not an act of calculated disruption? Celeste looked at him, a faint, pitying smile on her lips. Mr. Sterling, when a man's child is hungry, and all he has to trade is a day's work, he does not care about your ledgers and cash boxes. He cares about feeding his family. I did not disrupt commerce. I enabled survival. It is a principle that seems to be unfamiliar to your employer. The lawyer's face flushed. He was losing control. He turned to his final line of attack. And the night of the fire, did you not, by your very presence, incite a mob of concerned citizens, leading to a dangerous conflagration that threatened the entire town? Before Celeste could answer, Jude stood up. Your Honor, I was there. The mob was incited by lies. The fire was set by criminals. Mrs. Beaumont was the one trying to put it out. Sterling wheeled on him. An admirable, if biased, defense of your associate, Sheriff. But let us not forget your role in this. I would like to call Sheriff Jude Callahan to the stand. Jude took the oath, his face set like stone. Sterling saw his chance to use the lawman's own actions to condemn Celeste. Sheriff Callahan, Sterling began, let us be clear. Did you, acting in your official capacity, seal the Ojo Viejo well based on the requisition order presented by Mr. Pritchard? Yes, I did, Jude answered, his voice clear and steady. So you, the highest legal authority in this town, recognize the legitimacy of that order. Did you not? Sterling pressed, a triumphant gleam in his eye. I recognize the authenticity of the town seal on the document. Jude corrected him. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, it was not just to the judge, but to the entire town, to Celeste, and to the ghost of his own past failures. And it was a mistake. I followed the procedure, but I failed to see the truth. I was rigid when I should have been wise. I was more concerned with the letter of the law than its spirit. My duty is to keep the peace. And I have learned, through these events, that the peace is not threatened when a woman gives water to her thirsty neighbors. The peace is threatened when powerful men conspire to create thirst for their own profit. I failed in my duty when I placed that seal on Mrs. Beaumont's well. I am not failing in it now. He looked directly at Silas Pritchard. The crimes here are clear conspiracy, fraud, incitement to riot, and attempted arson, and they were all orchestrated by that man. Jude's confession, his public act of taking responsibility, was the final, devastating blow. It sucked all the air out of Sterling's case, leaving it a hollow, legalistic shell. The law had been twisted into a weapon by Pritchard, and Jude, by admitting his own error, had twisted it back into a shield for the innocent. Judge Blackwood listened to it all, his expression unchanging. When the testimony was finished, he sat in silence for a long time. The only sound, the mournful cry of the wind outside. Finally, he picked up the small wooden gavel. The findings of this court are as follows, he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The requisition order for the Ojo Viejo is declared fraudulent and is hereby nullified. Mr. Silas Pritchard, you are found guilty of conspiracy to defraud, incitement, and willful destruction of property. You will pay a fine of $5,000 to the court and full restitution to Mrs. Beaumont for the loss of her livestock and property. Mr. Wade Harlan, in light of your testimony, you are spared a prison sentence. You are stripped of your badge and banished from this territory. If you are seen here again, you will be arrested on sight. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled community. Finally, This court recognizes the unique historical and practical significance of the Ojo Viejo. It will therefore ratify the proposal put forth by Mrs. Beaumont. An Ojo Viejo Water Council will be formed, with one representative from the town, to be elected, one from the Mescalero people, to be appointed by their chief, and Mrs. Beaumont as its permanent third member, to oversee the just and equitable sharing of this vital resource. He lifted the gavel. When it came down, the sound was not the dull thud of wood on wood. In the silent church, it sounded sharp and clean, like a pickaxe striking a hidden spring deep underground. The sound of water and justice, finally breaking free. Spring arrived in the high desert not as a gentle guest, but as a sudden, powerful thaw. The great mountains of snow left by the blizzard melted under a strengthening sun. The water running in torrents down the single street, washing away the last of the red dust and the lingering bitterness of the hard winter. The parched earth drank deeply, and in gratitude, it offered up a miracle. The gray and brown plains erupted in a riot of color, a carpet of purple verbena and yellow primrose stretching to the horizon. Life had returned to dusty Mesa. With the new season came a new way of being, the Ojo Viejo Water Council, with Thompson elected as the town's representative and Chaco appointed by Nantan, became a model of quiet, effective cooperation. They set fair limits for irrigation and established a community fund from the sale of surplus water to passing wagon trains. The money designated for a proper town schoolhouse, the well, once a symbol of division and greed, was now the source of their shared future. Celeste's life blossomed with the landscape. The restitution from Silas Pritchard, paid under the watchful eye of the U.S. Marshal before he was escorted from the territory in disgrace, allowed her to rebuild and expand. She constructed a new, larger workshop, with one side dedicated to her sewing and the other to her remedies. But it became more than a shop. On 3 mornings a week, she cleared the main table, set out slates and chalk, and taught the town's children their letters and numbers. It was a chaotic, beautiful mix of Mescalero, Mexican, and Anglo children, all learning together, their initial shyness giving way to the simple, universal language of childhood games. The small building was no longer just a business. It was a school, a clinic, and a sanctuary. Jude, too, found a new purpose. 1 week after the trial, he unpinned the silver star from his chest and handed it to a newly elected Sheriff Thompson. It was not an act of resignation, but of liberation. He had upheld the law, had seen it bent and nearly broken, and had helped forge it into something stronger. Now, he wanted to build something of his own. With his savings and some of the money from the community fund, he bought the abandoned livery stable at the edge of town. He repaired the stalls, mended the fences, and began a horse rescue. He took in animals that were old, mistreated, or simply abandoned. His quiet patience and gentle hands healing wounds both visible and hidden. He had spent years policing men. Now he found a deeper peace in caring for creatures who could not lie. The culmination of this quiet transformation came on the first day of summer. The town declared a festival, the Festival of the Ojo Viejo, to celebrate their survival and their newfound unity. The air was filled with the smell of roasting corn and pit-barbecued beef, the sound of a lively banjo tune played by one of the Miller boys, and the laughter of children chasing hoops down the clean-swept street. Everyone was there. Nantan and his people came down from the mesas, not as distant strangers, but as neighbors, sharing smoked venison and stories. The Romero family set up a long table laden with tamales and fresh tortillas. Mr. Chen, his face wreathed in a rare, broad smile, handed out sweet mooncakes to the children. They gathered at the well, the heart of their community, its stone rim now smooth and clean. Celeste had organized a ceremony of remembrance and release. She had spent days weaving wreaths from the wildflowers that bloomed on the prairie. Now, she handed one to each family, to let go of the bitterness of the winter. She explained, her voice carrying in the warm, still air. and to welcome the new season of our life together. One by one, they stepped forward and gently floated their wreaths on the cool, clear surface of the well water. The colorful circles drifted together, a vibrant, floating testament to their shared journey. It was a letting go of the fear, the suspicion, and the hatred. It was a baptism for the whole town. When the last wreath had been cast, Jude, who had been standing quietly by her side, took her hand. His own was no longer the hand of a lawman, but of a man who worked with wood and leather, calloused and strong. He led her a little way from the crowd, to a spot under a lone cottonwood tree that was just beginning to offer shade. "Well, Celeste," he said, a familiar, wry smile playing on his lips. "It seems you have managed to tame this town after all."
"I think the town is taming itself, Jude," she replied softly. "I just gave it a place to start."
He looked out at the scene, the children playing, the families sharing food, the banjo music a cheerful heartbeat for the day. "It is a good start." He agreed. He grew quiet for a moment, the easy humor in his eyes replaced by a deep, unwavering sincerity. "I have been thinking. A man my age ought to have a home, not just a room behind an office or a bunkhouse in a stable. A real home." Celeste's heart gave a small, hopeful leap. "And what does a home look like to you, Jude Callahan?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple object that glinted in the sun. It was a silver ring, not polished and ornate, but with the soft, matte finish of something handmade. He placed it in her palm. It was cool and heavy. She looked closer and saw that a delicate, simple design had been etched into its surface, a circle with a single line dropping from its center, the symbol of a well. "It looks like this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It looks like a place with a strong foundation, a place with a deep, clear source of life, a place that is big enough for two people who thought they were too old for new beginnings." He looked at her, his pale blue eyes full of a love that was as quiet and profound as the landscape around them. "I am not a man for fancy words, but what I said in the stable that night, that has not changed. It has only grown deeper." A smile, bright and genuine, spread across Celeste's face, chasing away the last of the shadows from her past. "Your age, Sheriff," she teased gently, her eyes sparkling. "If I am not mistaken, I have a few years on you. Perhaps it is I who should be settling down with a younger, more energetic man." He laughed, a rich, easy sound that held all the warmth of the summer day. "Is that so? Well, this younger man is asking if you, Mrs. Beaumont, would do him the honor of building a home with him, and maybe filling it with more than just the two of us." He glanced toward a small girl with wide, solemn eyes, one of the children left orphaned by the hard winter, who was watching them from a distance. There are a lot of little souls in this world who need a safe place to land. Celeste's breath caught in her throat. A husband, a child, a family. It was a future she had long since packed away, a dream she had considered too old and worn to ever bring out into the light again. She closed her hand around the silver ring, the metal warming instantly against her skin. "Jude Callahan," she said, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it felt like prayer. "I believe building a home with you would be a fine and worthy adventure." Later that evening, as the festival wound down and the first stars began to appear in the vast, velvet sky, Celeste sat on her porch, the silver ring on her finger. Jude was down at his stable, settling the horses for the night. The sound of a distant harmonica drifted on the cooling air. She pulled a letter from her apron pocket, its paper soft and creased from many readings. It had arrived on the supply wagon 2 days before, a voice from another lifetime. It was from her younger sister, back in Louisiana. "Dearest Celeste," it read, "Your last letter was full of such strange and wonderful things. A town called Dusty Mesa, a well that saved a community, a sheriff with honest eyes. It sounds a hard place, but a good one. I am tired of the damp and the old ghosts here. I want to learn what you know. About the herbs, about sewing, about standing on your own 2 feet. Would there be room, do you think, for a younger sister in your new world?" Celeste folded the letter, a slow smile spreading across her face. Yes, she thought, looking out at the peaceful, star-dusted mesas. There was room. There was more than enough room for new beginnings. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.